I can't tell you how often I am asked, isn't there an easier way? Isn't there a shortcut? It comes often quite elaborately clothed in lots of different words and intellectual ideas, but the question behind it is, where is the easy way? There was a gentleman friend of mine who was in my classes when he lived here. He lives in another community now, but he was here for 10 or 15 years. I always liked having him in class because he asked very interesting questions. But over time, I began to realize it was always the same question. Now tell me the secret, how it's easier, okay? Recently, I was communicating with a friend who's in another country, far away, facing very difficult times. And, periodically she writes, hoping that I'll say something else. Other than just hang in there, honey, there's no choice. This is what you have to do. What choice do you have? When Swami Kriyananda was asked by Shivani at one point, what is the secret of spiritual success? That she asked him that way back in the 70s when we were all just starting out, and it all looked a lot easier. It looks easier now than it looked then, actually. But we were naive in our expectations. What is the secret? And one of the things he said was, when you realize that there is no alternative. In other words, when you just stop waiting to be rescued, there's an enormous part of us that just holds out in the hope that I won't ever really actually have to do that, whatever that might be for each of us. I was also speaking to a friend this morning. How many of us, we arrive, you generally have to be pretty dynamic before you even consider the path of self-realization. You have to be creative enough to look at this world and to hear all the voices that are telling you so many other things except give your life to God, just about almost anything but give your life to God. Then they'll argue with you about God. It just goes on and on and on. So you've got to have something inside of you that is able to see through the intense veil of confusion which passes for human life. Forgive me for being a little cynical this morning, but it's one of those mornings. I hope to bring it up a little bit before we're done. And if not, I'm sorry. I apologize in advance. But you have to be able to think for yourself. I don't mean you have to be a creative artist. You don't have to be able to paint or dance. But you have to be creative enough to imagine another life. And as a consequence, we tend to be a rather strong-minded group, especially Swami Kriyananda's children. In some context, there's a story about Master and some man who was always rebelling against what Master said and holding on to his own point of view and would come around eventually. But finally he said to Master, "I'm so sorry that I'm so stubborn." And Master said, "That's all right. I attract stubborn people." And he meant it as a compliment. There was a gentleman who was part of Ananda for a period of time. This is many decades ago. And he started an Ananda group at a time when we didn't have very many. He just took the initiative and started this whole group, named it Ananda, without a whole lot of permission from head office. We hardly had a head office at that time. And it was my job I was a circuit preacher at that point. I would travel about and spread the news, spread the good news. And this man just kept establishing himself more and more in his own position and so on. And finally, he incorporated legally in an Ananda group and declared himself spiritual director for life. And this was way beyond my pay grade. This was the early 80s. Now I think I might be able to handle it, but at that point I didn't know what to do. "Sir," I said to Swami, "I don't know what to do here." So Swamiji invited him to lunch, and they had a long and very interesting conversation about many things on the spiritual path. And he was a very strong-minded man with a lot of strong opinions, which Swami tried to mold, but didn't really argue. He just tried to direct it. And at the end of the lunch, Swami said so kindly, he said, "Spiritual director for life of Ananda," Swami said, "that's my job." He said, "If you want that job, maybe you should use a different name." So he went home and changed the name of his organization so he could be spiritual director for life of something. But what was most interesting about the whole experience was after he walked out, after he left, we said goodbye. I was in the room the whole time, of course. I cooked lunch and served and so on. And Swami said to me, anybody with a little spunk is just going to go ahead and do what they feel to do. They're not going to wait to be told what to do. And then he said, I much prefer a man like that. You see, because that's the kind of energy that you have to have. You have to be strong in this. And many of us came to Ananda with many precious opinions of our own that Swamiji often, over periods of years, gradually dismantled. I remember a friend of mine, actually, many of you know her, Naidruva. She's a black woman. I believe she was the first black woman to graduate from Harvard Law School. And I think she was part of the first coterie of women to graduate, significant little group, but I believe she was the first black woman to graduate. She became a lawyer just because God told her to do it. This was before she knew Ananda. And she graduated at a time when Martin Luther King was still living and doing all his work. And she never got to go to the South, even though she wanted to. She was herself from New York, but they kept her in the East Coast because she could work in the law offices, because she had that skill. It was actually very interesting, just to skip ahead. When Ananda faced enormous litigation by another spiritual group that tried to use the laws of intellectual property and copyright and trademark to gain exclusive rights to Yogananda's teaching. It was very clever, but it didn't work. And she was central to that effort for us. And she said it was a creative use of law to try to get religious monopoly, which happens to be illegal in the United States. And eventually they were defeated completely. We're standing here with Master's picture on the altar, so we won in that respect. When she was working for Martin Luther King for that effort, she said they had to do the same thing. Because there were no laws favoring civil rights, but there were laws about real estate and money and all kinds of things. And they had to think creatively how it could be applied to the situation at hand, which in itself, of course, was worth doing. But she also told me years later, because she lived here, she's a good friend of mine, and she said learning how to use law creatively really served her when she was working for us, because it was the same thing. It wasn't straightforward. Very, very interesting. I say all of this to give you an idea about how strong a woman she was. She was extremely committed to certain political points of view, strong points of view that I don't even know what the words are for them now, that Swami did not share, that Yogananda did not share at all. But even to the end, if you kind of poked her on those issues, she would just come out just the way she'd always come out. After all that dedication, after all that work, after a lifetime of Ananda, it was just where she was. And a lot of times that just happens. We become committed for one reason or another, and it's very hard for us to see past whatever these are. Some of them matter, some of them don't. But now where I'm trying to come to, but we're all in the same boat. I had that issue with him constantly because I totally respected Swamiji. I mean, there was just literally from the moment I saw him to this moment standing in front of you, I never doubted him. I always knew that he knew what he was doing, and on and on and on, I can say. But I'm very strong-minded, and I come to my own opinions for good reason. So I was often caught like that because I knew he knew more than I did, but I didn't yet understand why. But at the same time, I knew that it was death to me spiritually if I started, positing my opinions. And in his autobiography, Swami's autobiography, The Path, The New Path, he writes a chapter on attunement. That's our subject for today. For those of you who haven't read that book or haven't read that chapter recently, it's well worth going and reading it. And he comments in there, he said, one of the ways that people begin to lose their footing, spiritually speaking, is they say, oh yes, in spiritual matters, the teacher, the master, the guru, he really knows, but in this particular area, I know more than he does. That's how Judas did it. Judas was an apostle. Judas was one of the 12. He was chosen. He was a highly advanced soul. Sometimes it just becomes religion, becomes so simplistic. You don't know how to think about it. But when you go all the way back, Judas was one of the chosen to carry the light of Christ forward. But he behaved very badly. We all know Judas his name is synonymous with betrayal and everything that's terrible. But Judas had a small problem. This is how Yogananda explains it. This is how Swami explains it. He had a little problem. He was attached to money. He was also attached to status and position, and he was really impressed by people who had it. And he thought that the way Jesus could really be successful was to win the people who were in power. And he could never persuade Jesus that this is what he ought to do. Jesus just had this other idea about how things should go, and he associated with people who were not important in society, and he alienated those who were important. This was very distressing to Judas. And one of the ways that Master explains it, which is extremely interesting, is that when Judas engineered, because he played the part, he didn't cause the karma, but he played the part, engineered that Jesus would be arrested and would be tried. He never thought Jesus would be crucified. He thought that he would force Jesus to declare himself, but instead, he just surrendered and allowed himself to be crucified. Judas killed himself the very next day because it just did not work out the way he expected. But Swamiji takes that story all the way back, and he says it just started with, yes, he's a master and he has all these powers, but in this I know a little bit more. I have a PhD in this subject. I have a lifetime experience. I came from a family where I stood up and did all of this. This is the question of attunement. This is the question of, are we really accepting that there is a reality beyond the one I know?